Welcome to the Data Platform Summit 2020, and thank you for joining my session today on managing a Power Platform governance like a Rockstar. I'd first like to take a moment to thank Microsoft for this amazing sponsorship on the event. As you know, without this sponsorship, it's really hard to organize these kind of events, even in a virtual environment. So big shout out for them. A little bit about myself. So my name is Haniel Croitoru. I'm an enterprise architect working for Protiviti in Toronto, Canada. I've been in the Microsoft space for over 20 years now, started with SharePoint, moved on to Microsoft 365. I've been very heavily involved in the Power Platform for the last 3+ years, and also a lot of involvement in Microsoft Teams and other areas. So really, I look at the whole Microsoft ecosystem as a whole unit. I'm a 4 times Microsoft MVP and also recently published a book on managing your Office 365 deployment using agile methodologies. Anyways, enough about myself. I'm going to go back to my corner now, and let's talk about governance. So why do we even need to automate our processes, and what's the whole hype about it these days when we talk about business processes and RPA and all that? So the first reason is we want to automate our business processes to save time. So imagine doing some processes in a manual basis, whether it's having to do the same task over and over by going to a certain system, entering data, and then having to re-enter data in another system, very manual. So we automate things in order to make things faster. Reducing waste. It's 2020, but we still find that sometimes processes require going to an internet site, printing out documents, filling them out by hand, getting them scanned, getting them signed off by a manager, and then having them put back into the system. So very inefficient and wasting. Reducing risk. So if you want to share information with another person, what happens is human errors occur. So if you want to share some information, send something to somebody, and by mistake you send it to the wrong individual, you can have a very bad situation on your hand, which may potentially even lead into lawsuits. And so by automating a process, the systems don't make mistakes. They have very clear rules, they follow them, and they're able to produce the right results every time. Growing your business. So the first point I mentioned was that you're able to save time from individuals having to perform manual tasks. So those individuals are not going to have free time in their hand. And that time can be spent developing their own skills and helping the bottom line in revenue generating initiatives as opposed to doing very mundane tasks that they would normally be doing. And then another reason is that there is no other option. So in some cases, you may want a user to be able to interact with data from another system, but you don't want to give them direct access because there may be a lot of information there that they should not be privy to. And so by using automation, you're actually able to extract certain pieces of data, provide those to the user, which they can then manipulate and work with. So those are kind of a few reasons of why we even bother with this whole automation. So let's talk a little bit about the Power Platform, give you a high-level overview very quickly to look at the different components. As you can see on the screen, there are 7 key components that make up the platform. We got Power BI for analytics, we got Power Apps for forms, Power Automate for workflows, the Power Virtual Agent, which is the newest member for building chatbots. And then a layer beneath that, we have our connectors, we have AI Builder, and we have the Common Data Service. So let's dive into a bit more detail on those. Power Apps is essentially a very rich form building application platform that allows you to build mobile-first apps that can be either viewed or accessed directly on your mobile device, whether it's a tablet, whether it's a phone. You can even integrate it into your Microsoft team, into your SharePoint site, and other websites. So a lot of flexibility there. What's great about it is that it's a visual tool. So if you're familiar with building, for example, formulas in Excel and some visualization, it's very straightforward. You don't have to be a developer. It's a low-code or no-code solution. And then you have what are called connectors that allow you to interact with data from all these different sources that I'll talk about in a little bit later. Common Data Service, this is essentially like a database in the cloud where you have predefined entities of tables and columns that have logic, that have permissions and business rules associated with them. That is what allows you to build all of your data structure very, very quickly. We then have Power Automate. Power Automate essentially is the workhorse. This is what allows you to manipulate your data, take data from one source, move it to another, perform changes on it, Really a lot of flexibility around that. We then have Power BI. This is your visualization tool. So it can take data from multiple sources, match them together, and even allows you to ask questions in natural language. So you can say, what was the weather in Toronto in 1995 in a certain region? As long as the data is available to Power BI, it is actually able to provide the user with the answers based on a natural language. Then we have AI Builder. So this is taking all those tools that I mentioned, Power Apps and Power BI and Power Automate, and give it another level of logic, which is using cognitive services to understand images, to understand text, determine the language, understand sentiment, look at a picture, understand what's in that picture. So it really adds a whole layer of logic and smartness to your solutions that you're building in the Power Platform. And again, all of this is without having to write code. And then we have our data connectors. Think of the data connectors essentially as little plugs into other systems in the market. And it doesn't have to be Microsoft. There are today over 350 different connectors available in the Power Platform that allows you to seamlessly pull data from another system, manipulate that data, send it to another system, which in the past, if you wanted to do this, for example, with SharePoint Design or other types of workflow solutions, you'd have to actually build these connectors from scratch. Now, if you happen to work in an environment and there is a certain system that does not have a connector today, you can actually build your own. It's not very difficult. So those are kind of the key building blocks. And as you can see that there's a lot of information, there's a lot of functionality available to you. So let's talk about how do we actually govern this entire platform. So you may know this very good quote from the movie Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. Well, when great power is not properly managed, you can get into pretty bad situations. So let's look at how do we actually govern the Power Platform properly. There are 6 key areas that I'm going to be touching on for the next 45 minutes or so. The first one is the governing body. Who are the individuals that are responsible to ensure that the platform is properly governed? And you'll see that it's more than just one person. There's actually a whole team that needs to be involved. We're then going to look at licensing. So Power Platform licensing is actually quite complex. There's a lot of components to it. So we'll take a very high-level look at it just to give you an understanding of what are the things you need to consider when you're looking to govern the environment. Then we have security. This is a key area that people are concerned with. Why? Because it's the data, it's the corporate data that you're dealing with, that you're touching with these workflows, with these forms. You want to make sure that everything is secure. The last thing you want is to build some automation, which all of a sudden is going to result in data leakage. We'll talk about monitoring, right? So how do you keep tabs on what's happening in the environment? So there's a number of tools available. We'll touch on those a little bit. Related to monitoring is alerting. So where monitoring is passive, you have to actually go in and do something. Alerting will actively inform you the moment that something happens. And you want to have certain alerts available so that if something goes sideways, you know about it right away. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about application lifecycle management. So even though I talked about the Power Platform solutions as being no code, low code, there still is an element of it's an application that you're building for your users. If a change happens, it doesn't matter if it's a code change or if it's a visual change. The change needs to be properly managed so that you're not breaking something in production, so that your users are aware of it, and then you can roll back that change. So it's really important to follow those practices. And that is also something that is considered as part of the governance. So let's start looking at the different areas. First, we have the governing body. So the governing body for the Power Platform, think of it as having 2 key areas. We have the tactical, and these are the teams that are looking at your Power Platform on a daily basis, a weekly basis, to make sure that the lights are on, everything is working fine. And then we have a strategic body that is looking at what do we do for the future? Are the businesses being served properly? So we have an operational committee under tactical, and they're the ones who look at the fact that the lights are on, everything is working fine, if there's any patching that needs to be added to the client machines, even though it's a SaaS-based solution, anything that needs to be communicated, or any sort of maintenance that may happen, or even just reviewing what's being done, licensing, things like that. That is what the operational committee is going to be doing. We then have the support committee. This is your first line support. A workflow is failing, or somebody doesn't have access to an app. Maybe they have access, but they're not getting the results that they're getting. This is a support committee that is going to be available to provide that help to the users, the first line. And then we have the strategic committee. And so for the strategic committee, again, you wanna be forward thinking. You wanna give the users a chance, or the business a chance to voice their requests and make sure that they're being considered. And so in the strategic committee, you wanna have more than just IT. You actually wanna have representation from the different business units, so that when you are making recommendations and when you're looking to change that platform, that you are in fact taking into consideration the needs of the whole as opposed to just a small team. And so altogether, that makes up your governance body. You want to make sure that they are handling your day-to-day needs, as well as the long-term thinking of the platform. The types of roles. So in the last slide, I was talking about strategic and tactical. For the tactical team, there are a few roles that may need to be assigned to certain individuals that allows them to perform certain tasks in the Power Platform. And so there are 4 key roles that are listed on the screen. You've got the global admin, Power Platform admin, Dynamics 365 service admin, and delegate admins. Typically, global admins should not be assigned to users on a regular basis, because that gives them almost unlimited access to do whatever they want. While it gives a lot of power, it is also very risky, because if you make a mistake, that can be very detrimental. And so the Power Platform admin role is the one that typically would be used, or should be used, to certain admins to assign them permissions to perform tasks. Even those ones, you want to be very limiting. You don't want to give too many people those access levels. With Dynamics 365 service admins, similar to Power Platform, but is more focused around the Dynamics 365, which is closely related to the Power Platform. And then the delegate admins, if you're working with a consulting firm, for example, and you want to give them access to perform certain tasks on your behalf, you're going to be using those delegate admin accounts. So, quick recap around the governance body. So first of all, early on in the process, you want to establish the body. You want to make sure that you have the right people sitting at the table to make those decisions. You want to be assigning the right Power Platform service accounts to certain individuals to be able to perform their tasks. So that's in a nutshell what you want to think about for the governance body. All right, let's switch over to licensing. So as I said in my opening slide, licensing is complex. There's lots that goes to it, and as you can see from the screen, there's a lot happening here. The different colors are trying to represent the different apps or services that are part of the Power Platform, but those are just scratching the surface. There's a lot of detail that goes into how do you determine if you need a per user plan versus a per flow plan for Power Automate. Should you use with attended or unattended RPA, right? So there's a lot of thoughts that go into that. And so again, the idea behind this slide is just to tell you that there are things to consider. There are building blocks. So sometimes if you get a certain level, that will allow you to perform certain tasks, but you may need to get additional licenses. Now, when you look at the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you can actually look at specific individuals and look at the accounts that they have access to and see exactly what licenses they have. Now, in addition to the basic licenses, sometimes you need to get what is called added capacity. So if you have a license that allows you to perform a certain amount of actions per month and you know that you're going to be exceeding it, you may have to buy additional capacity for those specific users or for the specific services. So again, you can see here that there are certain considerations. For example, if you want to have external users access your Power Apps, you can invite them as guest users. That's possible in Microsoft 365. But those users will now use the Azure B2B external collaboration, which has a cost to it. So you really want to think about what are the different elements. Self-service license purchase. So by default, when you set up Microsoft 365, every user is able to purchase their own licenses for the Power Platform. It is not ideal because what happens is users can start buying the licenses. They can start building solutions, which all of a sudden they start sharing with other users. And before you know it, this one solution that was built by an individual is now being used across half the organization. It is not properly governed. Nobody really authorized the use of it. And then one day that user is going to come to IT and says, hey, I've got this huge bill that I've been collecting for this one solution that is being used by everybody. I need you to now pay me for that solution or for those licenses. So you want to be careful. You don't want to get yourself into that situation. And the best way to avoid that is by disabling users from creating their own or buying their own licenses within your tenant. So some basic recommendations around licensing, again, just to recap. So licenses are expensive. So you want to be reviewing them on a regular basis to make sure that people are only using the licenses. If there's licenses that are not being used, you want to remove them. And you also want to consider, when possible, using a trial tenant or other environments, development environments, to do any sort of testing, so you're not just using up additional licenses when you don't have to. And that's in the community plan. And also the last thing I mentioned around licensing is that you want to be able to disable the self-service license purchases to avoid any cost that may be incurred later on. All right, security. So this is a big topic. The Power Platform runs on something called environments. So think about an environment as being a big container that has solutions in it that can have apps and workflows and data and connections, and all of those elements that you use to build your Power Platform solutions are stored inside environments. By default, there's a default environment that everybody belongs to. The good thing about having different environments is that you can decide who has access to that environment, and also the data, it gets stored separately in different environments. One thing is important to note is that every environment belongs to a specific location, a geography. And so if you're working in an international organization, you may have, for example, data privacy laws that say that if you are in Europe, you have GDPR. So the data has to stay there. It cannot leave the data centers that are in Europe. There may be other laws around the world. And so when you create your environments, you want to make sure that you select the right environment. Sorry, the right location. And be careful, because once you are assigned a location to the environment, you cannot change it. If you need to change it later, you need to delete that environment and create a new one. And so there's about 6 different types of environments available in the Power Platform. Default environment, which is something I already mentioned, is an environment that everybody has access to, every single user. You cannot remove users. You cannot delete that environment. There's only limited, even as an admin, as a global admin, there's only limited functionality that you can perform on that environment. So you just have to be careful on how that's going to be used. Then you have production environments. Those are the ones that you should be using in your tenant, in your organization, where you put your production-ready solutions. Because that means that if they're in production, they have probably been tested, developed, following process, properly governed. So that is what you want to be using. Then we have sandbox, and these are essentially test environments. So you can put a solution in there, you can make changes, you can delete all the data and reuse the same sandbox for another purpose. And so you'll see in a little bit, I'll talk about the whole life cycle, but the idea behind it is that you put a build, you test it out, and then once you're done with it, you can delete it and just put something else into that sandbox. Trials, those can be set up for an individual. There's one per user, but try to use those trials for trying something new. So do you want to do proof of concept or try some changes? So rather than using up the licenses and paying for the environment, consider using trial environments as much as possible. Development environment, so again, they belong to the community plan. So every user can sign up for a developer environment. They cannot share or have other people invited to it. And the purpose is to develop their own solutions in that development environment. That's the core purpose of it. And then we have something new, which is Project Oakdale, which is building solutions for the Power Platform. For Microsoft Teams using the Power Platform. And so when somebody goes and builds a Power App or some solution directly in Microsoft Teams using Project Oakdale, they get an environment set up in their Power Platform. However, that environment is limited in terms of what the admin can do, because it's controlled more by Teams and the user who's created it. So a few considerations around the environments. So the first one is the default environment should be renamed something like personal productivity, so that it's very clear to the users that it's not intended to be used for production solutions. Establish a process for requesting environments. So I said before that you don't want people to just go and start creating their own environments, but you want users to be able to request one. Maybe somebody is being asked to develop a new solution, or maybe there's something that needs to be put into production and you want to request that environment. You can actually build in the Power Platform a process to request and then provision the environment directly through the Power Platform itself. Again, carefully select the region, because once you've selected a region for the environment, you cannot change it. And then try to use as many of the individual tenants as possible to reduce the cost you're going to have on environments. And restrict the creation of environments so that it is controlled, so that just like with the licenses, you're not going to have users starting to go and create their own environments as they want. So those are some areas around how you can secure the data and how you can secure in your environment, your Power Platform using environments. Now, another area to secure is by reducing the access. And there's multiple ways. So least privilege access. Power Platform respects the permissions assigned to any service that the Power Platform connects to. For example, if I build a workflow that is going to go to my SharePoint list, I cannot do more with that SharePoint list than my Microsoft 365 permissions allow me to do. And so it doesn't matter what access I have in Power Platform, those permissions on the services are being respected. Network access control. So you can actually limit login from certain locations. So today, unfortunately, it's COVID. A lot of us are working from home, but you may want to set up certain service accounts and say they can only be accessed from a certain IP, which may be inside of the building of your office. If somebody tries to come in from outside and use a service account, they're going to be blocked. So that's another way for you to limit who has access to the data. Then we have location-based conditional access. So if you're working with something like Microsoft Intune to control your mobile devices, again, you can limit who can access your Power Platform and from what type of devices. Data loss prevention. So with data loss prevention, you have those 350 plus connectors I was talking about, and they can be divided into 3 different groups. Within a policy, a data loss prevention policy, you can block certain connectors so that the users cannot use them at all. And then the ones that are available for use can be segregated into 2 groups, business and no business. And the purpose behind it is that you don't want to get into situations where people are building workflows or solutions where you have business critical data being used with non-critical solutions. For example, I don't want to have my users access the SharePoint site, which has IP information in it, and go and tweet about it. And so I will put my Twitter account or my Twitter connector into the non-business data for the DLP policy and keep my SharePoint under the business data. So that's just one simple example. Now, when you have those data loss prevention policies, you have to be careful, because if you're rolling it out, if there's a workflow that is essentially has a conflict because it now has business and non-business connectors used together, those are going to stop working. So you have to make sure that you, for example, use the Power Platform Center of Excellence to determine whether a new policy is going to have an impact on existing solutions. There's also 23 connectors that are in the default environment that you cannot remove. So again, you have to be cognizant that as much as you try to restrict the default environment, you will not be able to go anywhere below those 23. And also, if you have Power Apps that have been published, if you release a new DLP policy, it's not going to affect anything that is published. If you were to make a change to the app and try to republish it, at that time it's going to check and see if there's a conflict and will not let you republish. So again, something you want to consider. And so there's ways to set up different types of restriction policies, DLP policies, to allow different combinations. So you want to have something which is restricted, unsupported non-Microsoft connections, which essentially says anything that is not Microsoft, disable it by default and allow Microsoft connectors. And you might want to make that available to all of your environments. But then you want to go a bit more restrictive, for example, in the default environment, where you block all of the non-Microsoft as well as whatever Microsoft wants you are able to block, to really give the users a very, very limited tool set to work with, so that you're not going to run into any risky situations with your data. And then you have unrestricted connectors, and this is where you start getting into more of the elevated permissions for the users, where they can build workflows or other types of solutions that are using more of the connectors that they have. So, for example, if you look at the access to, in this particular grid, I have the bottom left, which is the citizen developer. Think of it as the default environment that everybody has access to. Now, if you look at the vertical bar, access to limited data, I may want to not give additional access, but let's say I have somebody in the marketing department who I do want to give access to build workflows to access social media such as Twitter or Facebook or other types of outlets to post information to the internet. So again, for certain users, I may say I want to give them more connectors to access. And so that is where I start opening up the access level and go into higher set of connectors. Then if you go across the bottom, that's where you have the lower set of connectors, but now you give access to more data. So again, depending on the usage scenario, you may want to say, rather than just letting somebody access a single SharePoint list, I may want to say, you know what, maybe I want to have a number of SharePoint lists accessed. So for example, if I have somebody who's working in records retention, I want them to be able to access all the documents across my SharePoint site as opposed to just the one that they work in, so that they can run some reports and tell me, are there any documents that don't have a retention policy? And so again, they're not going beyond in terms of the connectors, they're working with a limited set, but they have access to more data. And then you have the top right block or square, and that represents what solutions are that would be built by IT, where you have to have a lot more rigor, but you also have more flexibility, more systems, more connectors to work with. So again, this picture just shows kind of that there's different levels of access by connector and by the services that you're accessing to see how you're going to be working with your data. The more restrictive you have to be, or you want to be, the less access you want to give to your users, the safer you're going to be, because your users are not going to be able to do as much. Pretty straightforward. HTTP triggers. So for anybody who has built workflows before in Power Automate and who's used the HTTP trigger, may or may not be aware that you can actually call a flow with an HTTP trigger from anywhere in the world with no authentication. And for some organization, that's going to put up a red flag, because what it means is that somebody from outside can just be, surfing or trying to figure things out and just try to cause problems. And so we want to be able to avoid that. And one way to do that is whenever you're using an HTTP trigger is by leveraging either Azure API management to ensure that whoever is calling it is coming from an authorized IP address or account, i.e. somebody in your tenant. Or another way to do it is to insert some sort of a token into your workflow itself, and it's going to check to see that the user who's making the call is using the right token. So the token is easier to implement a little, but what it means is that if the token is for some reason exposed and made available to somebody, then again, that whole workflow can now be accessed by somebody who's got access to that token. Sharing apps and flows. So I said before that for security reasons, when you're sharing apps and when you're sharing workflows and other types of solutions, the data itself is not impacted. So you have to be careful. If you're going to build some solution that is going to be shared with others, you have to review all the data points that are being accessed for reading, for writing, and you want to make sure that the users who are getting access to them also have that access to those systems so they can actually run these workflows or work with these apps properly. Imagine you're going to be sharing an app with somebody that goes and reads something from Dynamics, and they're going to come back and say, I'm sorry, but I keep getting an empty list every single time. Well, the reason is maybe they don't have access to those dynamic entities or other areas. Now, if you're working with environments or solutions that need to access certain systems on-premise, this may be a SharePoint on-prem environment, maybe a SQL database, Oracle, there's a whole bunch of them. And so you use the on-premise gateway to essentially access on-premise information from the cloud. And it acts as that proxy to shuttle data back and forth. Works really great, but what you don't want is to have your users start creating those gateways themselves and access data, again, to manipulate, because that is a bit risky. With service accounts, so you should never have workflows or solutions running in an individual's account. That's very risky, because if that person leaves and if you disable their account, you have effectively disabled that solution. And that's a big risk. So ideally, you want to have a service account that is going to be using something like the per flow plan or per user plan. And the idea behind it is that account will always be live. It's never going to go away as long as you have those solutions that need it. You want to give it a nice, long, complex password that is not going to expire on a regular basis. And it doesn't need MFA because otherwise, every time that workflow or solution runs, it's going to ask the user to provide authorization, which you shouldn't have to do on a service account. So some key considerations around that. So just to kind of summarize around the data loss prevention and security, so you want to restrict your environments to only the connectors and the data that users should have access to. Anything beyond that is too much. These already mentioned the non-production and production, so I already said that. Make sure that anything that you're doing is authorized. So I talked about the HTTP trigger. So users should not be just able to call your workflows. You want to make sure that they're authorized to do so. When you're sharing an app, make sure that the data that is being accessed is also being properly shared so that you're not creating a broken environment. And you want to be able to review your DLP policies before you roll them out so that you're sure that you are implementing them correctly. However, you're not breaking anything that's already in production. And then use service accounts when you're going to be building these solutions because, again, you don't want to be in a situation where a user account is now disabled because somebody has left your organization and moved on, and now whatever they owned is now not working anymore. And the last one that I made was around the data gateway. So you don't want to have your users actually go and create their own gateways because that, again, adds an element of risk to it. All right, so let's talk about monitoring now. So what does monitoring mean? It basically gives you a way to view what is happening inside the Power Platform at any time. And as you can see from the screen, there are essentially 6 different portals or dashboards that you can access to get a lot of that information that you're looking for. Some of it is built in, some of it is custom, but let's go through and kind of see the kind of information that you can gather. So the first one is around the Common Data Service, and this is part of the Power Platform Admin Center. You want to know who are the active users, what type of models are being accessed inside of your Common Data Service, because as I mentioned, that is part of your database. What entities are being used. There's a cost. The more data you store, the more you have to pay. So if there's data that is not being used and it's old, maybe you can purge it so you don't have to pay so much. What kind of system jobs, plugins are running, which API calls are being made. Entities have mailboxes with them. Are they being used or not, and how much? So again, a lot of details you can get about the data service just by looking at the Power Platform Admin Center. Now, you can set up auditing on individual entities, and you can actually go down to the field level to get a sense of what is being done, track the changes. So that sounds really good for somebody who cares about audits and all that information. But what you also have to keep in mind is that the audit logs themselves also carry a cost to them. And so the more logging you do, the more your logs are going to grow, and you have to consider that because too much data just means you're going to be collecting a lot of information, and you're going to have to pay for that. So you have to find that fine balance of how much data you need versus how much data is too much. And this is something you'd be working with the business and the developers to come to that common ground. So this is the kind of information you get from the Power Platform Admin Center. Then we have the Power Apps Admin Center. And this is where you can look at what apps are being used. Where are they being accessed from, right? Maybe, like you can see on the dot right here, I've got some apps being accessed from Africa. Maybe you don't have anybody in Africa, and you may be wondering, well, what's going on there? And you have to go a little bit deeper. So it gives you that kind of information. If there's any errors that are being generated, how is the system performing? Is it too slow? Are there certain peak times or certain apps that are performing poorly? You can get that information and go a little bit deeper and drill into that. Which of the apps are being used? We talked a lot about connectors, right? So are there any connectors that are used a lot versus ones that are not being used? And so maybe you have to set up certain DLP policies that says the ones that are being used a lot, maybe put them into the business connectors, and then other ones, let's remove them. So again, you're just limiting your exposure that way. Power Automate dashboard or center, you can look at the runs that are running, how often and when they were running, which ones are being used, who they were created by, when they were created. Are there any errors in the workflows, right? So again, this is where you can be proactive and just look into it on a regular basis and find out if there's any errors. Are workflows being shared? That's an important one because maybe you don't want them to be shared. Again, what kind of connectors are being used? So a lot of the basic information, it's all available out of the box. All you have to do is just go to the admin center and look at the details. Capacity. So I already talked about it a few times. Inside of the Power Platform Admin Center, you want to be able to follow the capacity to find out how much capacity is available, how much is being used, was any add-on capacity purchased, and then for Microsoft Teams specifically for Project Oakdale, how much is being used in the solutions from your total pool of data that is available. Then we have the Azure Monitoring Application Insights. So this is when you want to find out more about the individuals. Where are they accessing these applications from? What device, what operating system, what location? When did their session start? When did the session end? So a lot of those details, which is more about the user themselves and their habits, is something that you can get from the Azure Monitor Application Insights. Then we have the Security Center, Security and Compliance Center. And the Security and Compliance Center has something called the Unified Audit Logs. And those audit logs effectively track almost all of the activities that are happening for all of the accounts, for all the users, for all the applications inside of Microsoft 365. And what you can see in the table on the screen is there are a number of key activities that are being tracked for Power Automate and for Power Apps, again, inside of the environment. So you might want to know, is somebody creating a new app or is somebody sharing a workflow? And so you can find out that information directly from the audit logs. Now, the audit logs are only going to be kept for a certain amount of time. So if you want to keep them longer, if your organization has a security information and management system, you can export those logs on a regular basis to make sure that you've got the longer history. Power Virtual Agent, it also has its own dashboard, but it's different. It's not so much about security, it's more about the quality of the service. Are people happy with the results that they're seeing, or are they not? Do we need to make any modifications to these chatbots to improve the overall quality? That's what this dashboard is for. And then a really important one, it's called the Power Platform Center of Excellence. So this is actually a tool that is built using the Power Platform itself. So it's using model-driven apps and Power BI dashboards and CDS and workflows. And it aggregates a lot of information from your tenant to provide you with more detailed views and drill downs into the governance around your site. What is being used, how it's being used, etc. It's meant as a starting point. It is not meant as just taking the Power Platform Center of Excellence, installing it, and being done with it. You're supposed to build on it for your specific organizational needs to answer a lot of the questions about the hows and the whys. And that's the, again, it provides a lot of those details. Service health, so it's always good to know if there's a problem. You can subscribe to your health reports in Microsoft 365 Admin Center, but there's also a couple of websites for Power Apps and Flow that you can go to, and it will show you right away if there's any sort of interruption in service or degradation. You can find it out. And then if you have an issue that you're experiencing that may not be listed anywhere, you can go into the Power Platform Admin Center, and under Help and Support, you can actually submit a ticket to get more information. And as you're filling it out, it's going to give you suggestions just in case somebody may have experienced the same issue. All right, so with monitoring, enabling CDS entity auditing is good. Just want to make sure that you find that nice balance between how much is enough and how much is too much. You should, on a regular basis, use that monitoring. So if you remember when I talked about the governance team, there was the operational, the tactical team, which had operations and support. The operational team should be reviewing those and monitoring those logs on a regular basis to make sure that everything is working fine. And this is where you can look at a lot of different activities. I'm not going to go through every one of those. Looking at the Security Center audit logs, again, you can get a lot of information from there that may not be listed in the other logs. keep track of those. And there's also webhooks you can set up so that you can get notified the moment that something gets logged in the audit logs. Export it into SIEM if you have access to one. And then I highly recommend you download and install the Power Platform Center of Excellence, because again, that is going to give you a lot more insights that you may not have available straight out of the box. All right, let's switch over to alerting. So monitoring, as I said, was a passive task so that a user has to go look at the logs to find out the information. But what if you want to just be notified about something that is critical? How do you do that? So there's essentially two key mechanisms. The first one is PowerShell. There's a library that you can download and install. It's free, and it allows you to perform a lot of different tasks around CDS, around Power Apps, around Power Automate, even managing your environments, and those type of tasks. So this table is just a kind of a quick summary of some of the key activities that you can perform, but there's lots more that you can do. So if you want to do some active monitoring and get notifications, PowerShell is really good at providing you with that information. There's also connectors. So when we talked about those 350 plus connectors that are available in the Power Platform, few of them are Power Platform connectors themselves. And they'll let you manage your Power Apps, your Power Automate workflows, where you can create them and enable them and disable them and share them and do all of that directly from within your workflows themselves. So imagine scenarios where you want to build a workflow where the moment that somebody creates their first ever app or workflow, it sends them a welcome message and information on how they should be using it. That's an example. And so with alerting, really the PowerShell and Power Platform connectors are your key tools that you should be using to get as much information active as you can. All right, and that brings me to the last section. And this is around the application lifecycle management. So there's a few things to consider when you're building these applications. The first one is that you want to provide, as part of governance, you want to give your users a starting point. You don't just want them to go crazy and say, do whatever they want. So if you're building similar to the Power Platform Center of Excellence, almost like a training center of excellence, where you can provide instructions, documentation, samples, videos. You can also create shells for your Power Apps and for your flows that the users can use as a starting point. And so what you can see on the screen right here, I have a very simple workflow that I built, and it only has a few placeholder tasks that a user would then be taking and modifying them to their needs, but at least you know that if they follow the general structure, they know that at least they're starting off on the right foot. And this is the kind of information that you want to provide the users when you're doing templating. Now, as I said before, going back to the environments, that there's different types of environments available, but how do you use them together? So the default environment, we already said that environment is supposed to be used for personal productivity, not for solution. So we're going to take that one, move it aside. We're left with the development, sandbox, and production environments. So imagine we're asked to build an application. What you should be doing is every developer should be provisioned with their own dev environment. That is an environment that only they have access to, nobody else. They should be able to build a solution, and once they're ready to start testing, all the developers should then be able to move their solution into a sandbox. And the idea behind the sandbox is that all of your testers have access to it to try it out, provide feedback, and if things are great, awesome. If there's a bug, something has to be fixed, goes back to the development environment, to the developers, they make the changes and redeploy. If you remember, I said before, the sandbox is that the idea behind it is that you can reset it, all the data in it, and start fresh. Once the test environment is done, you then create another sandbox. That is used for business testing, user acceptance testing. So your testers are not going to be the technical testers. This is going to be a different user group. And again, the purpose for them to go in there, test out the solution, provide their feedback. If things need to be fixed, it goes all the way back to the developers who fixed the issue, because it then goes back to the first sandbox where they verified, back to the second sandbox for UAT. Once everything is done and ready, it is then deployed to the production environment, which everybody has essentially read access or execute access on the solutions. but management is only limited to IT group. So this is how you should be governing your overall application lifecycle management from an environment's point of view. Now, environments have what I call solutions. So I didn't talk about it too much before, but the idea behind solution is its packaging. You can have your Power Apps, your workflows, your dashboards, all of those packaged into a solution. And this is more for when you have CDS and entities. And the idea behind it is that Microsoft gives you a predefined set of solutions that are managed. And the idea behind manage is that you cannot change whatever is managed. You can build on top of it. You can enhance it, but you cannot change the core. And so Microsoft is going to give you solutions which then your development team, IT, can start building their own managed solutions. So they're going to build solution A, version 1.000, and then over time, there's going to be some patches they need to apply, but that's being added on top of that solution A 1.000. At some point, they're going to release solution 2. But all of that is managed. And the reason you say it's managed is that once that is then given to the business or somebody else who then wants to further build on it, for them, it's going to remain unmanaged. So a user will be able to change whatever they want in their own unmanaged layer, but everything underneath, they will not be able to modify. They're just building on top of that. And so it's kind of that upward motion of having managed bubbling up to eventually the highest level of that is unmanaged is how you should be controlling or managing the solutions within the Power Platform. So again, just to summarize a few notes. So you want to provide your users with some standards of how to build solutions, workflows, apps, other types of solutions. Give them some tools, give them something to guide them in the right direction. It's not ideal when somebody's just starting off and say, just start building and then keep saying this is not good and that's not good. You have to change this and that. So if you give them something to start with, that's typically a better approach. Deploy managed solution as much as possible, which is what I just mentioned. For development, again, your development environment should be single purpose. So every development environment should be for one solution. So if a developer is working on 2 different projects, ideally they should have 2 development environments, because you don't want to have potentially one solution that is going to impact another solution. You're essentially going to get that kind of a contamination happening. Okay. And then once the project is done, development is done, you can dispose of the development environment and then recreate a new one. But what you want to make sure is that you store your data in a central location. So for example, something like Azure DevOps, if you're using that, use that as your repository. So if something happens, developments go down, you always have that source available for you. And then solution packager, didn't talk about that much, but the idea behind the solution packager is that it can test and make sure that your solution is valid, that there's no issues with it. It has all the necessary dependencies and pieces. And already mentioned the last point around the development test and production pipeline. Again, it allows for that cyclical resolution of any issues or problems. And try to automate some of those tasks when you can. So, a lot of information, short time. I wish I could have spent much more time with you. I do have my contact information if you just look right below here. Feel free to reach out, ask me any questions, love to connect and continue the conversation. For the meanwhile though, thank you so much to all the organizers for this wonderful summit. I hope you enjoyed and I hope we will speak again very soon.